Hello and welcome back to the series of lectures on ornamental plants. So far we have talked about the cultivation of ornamentals in the field. But from now on we will talk about cultivation of ornamentals in pots which are transportable to any area and wherein we can cultivate those plants which are not ordinarily suitable to those habitats. For example, if we want to cultivate a tropical plant in a temperate habitat under natural conditions, it is impossible. However, when we cultivate the same plants in a pot, that pot can be adjusted in desired conditions under desired atmospheric pressure as well as temperature, and we can maintain them for as long as we want. Ordinarily, the pots are essentially portable entities wherein a plant after its cultivation can be transported to any area where we want to keep it for ornamentation. Generally, the pots are those structures in which, as per desired habitat of the plant, we can alter not only the condition of that but also transport to the desired habitats. For each pot, we must have a specific arrangement in terms of the type of the habitat it is suitable, as well as in terms of the temperature and aquatic conditions in which we can maintain it. Generally, a pot is a structure which has a tendency to establish a plant in terms of its requirements as well as facilitate whatever requirements the plant is in need of. Ordinarily, these pots can be constructed of any material. However, on the basis of the type of the plant that we cultivate as well as the purpose for which we cultivate them, we can actually use many different types. For example, as you can see, we can have pots which can be earthen, we can have pots which can be cemented, we can have pots which can be plastic entities, and for transportation we sometimes use even poly bags, as you can see again. Ordinarily, the fundamental requirement of these pots is that they must have a suitable shape as well as structure, which in turn can maintain whatever type of the plant we want to cultivate in them. In general, each pot must have two basic structures. One, its base must have a small pore so that whatever moisture we add to it, if it is added in excessive quantities, that can ooze out. And second, it must have a wider structure at the top, again as you can see, so that whatever excessive moisture is added, some of it can also get evaporated through it. In general, it has been seen that if we use cemented pots, their durability as well as the potential of the plants that we grow in them is not as good as we see in case of those pots which are constructed of the mud, or which we normally refer to as the earthen pots. It has been seen that in cemented pots, the evaporative mechanism ordinarily gets hampered, which in turn affects drastically the survival potential as well as its physiological activities. Second, if we sometimes use plastic entities, that is, wherein we use plastic pots, in those a similar problem is faced, that is, wherein the evaporative mechanism gets hampered, which in turn drastically affects the productive potential, quality as well as durability of the plant that we cultivate in them. As you can see, in all these different types of pots, even though the shape, the structure is almost identical, but the quality as well as the product in these is also reflecting its commercial value. In general, in all these pots, the basic requirement is that we must be able to add suitable quality of the soil, which in turn has a potential to actually provide whatever the plant needs. Generally, in pot plantation, there is a basic requirement of addition of sandy textured soil. As we see that if we do not add sand, the texture of the soil becomes hard and the absorptive as well as evaporative mechanism of whatever we add to that gets hampered. In general, it has been seen that if a pot is to be prepared, in that pot we try to mix up two different types together. As you can see again, we get the loamy or clay soil, and with that we mix roughly 40 to 50% of the sand, so that once this mixture is made, the evaporative mechanism, that is transpiration mechanism of the plant that is actually to be planted in that particular pot, is able to function normally. Once this soil as well as the sand has been mixed, it is seen that these pots need a proper protection of the pore that is created at the bottom. Ordinarily, this pore must actually allow proper seepage as well as evaporation of excessive quantities of the moisture. As you can see, in these pots, what is done is small pieces of earthen pots, that is broken pots, are added so that the soil or the sandy textured soil that has been added does not ooze out through that pore. As you can see again, it means that that pore is allowed to only allow the excessive seepage of the moisture, while as it in turn protects the seepage or the loosening of the soil through that pore. Once these pots have been prepared in terms of the different desired types of soils, in these pots ordinarily two types of nutrients are to be added. First and basic requirement is the addition of organic nutrients, wherein usually either the cow dung manure or whatever waste of the foliage of a plant or the grasses is available, that is added so that that in turn is able to maintain the soil within the pots. Again, as you can see, what is done is that the organic manures or the foliage, dried foliage, crushed foliage is added so that that in turn can actually maintain the soil in the pot in its positive characters. Then after addition of these, there is a second requirement of adding inorganic nutrients, wherein on the basis of the type of the plant that we cultivate. If it is green foliaceous plants, we tend to add excessive quantities of either NPK, DAP or urea, or if it is purely a normal flowering plant, in those cases usually DAP and smaller quantities of NPK and urea added. Once these materials have been added, this in turn actually facilitates the suitable atmosphere or suitable habitat for the plant that we want to cultivate in these. Once these pots have been filled up, the third important requirement is of adding suitable quantities of moisture. It is important to add this moisture even prior to the plantation of the plants. As again you can see, this is primarily to adjust the soil in the pot so that the whatever magnetic spaces are there, whatever spaces between the molecules of the soil or granules of the soil are there, those get filled up by the water. Essentially, this is important because if there are any gaps in the soil, that means if there are hollow spaces in the pot, that hollow space or that hollow gap in turn drastically negatively affects the survival of the plant in that, and subsequently we find that the depth of the pot becomes smaller, as well as the moisture that we add in turn actually depletes the soil concentration to the pore at the bottom. Once these pots have been irrigated, it takes roughly estimated 3 to 4 days so that the soil gets properly adjusted in that pot. Once has been, the moisture and soil has been adjusted, at that stage there is a need to test whether the soil in terms of texture as well as in terms of quality is suitable for specific plants. That can either be done manually, wherein the gardeners or commercial practitioners, as you can see, can with the help of their hand or digging chisels etc. test them. If it is found suitable at that stage, they tend to separate these pots into different sections so that in each section a specific type of the plant can be cultivated. Now here, one basic requirement is that if we have a plant which is adapted to dry conditions, we normally refer to that as a xerophyte. In that case, it has been seen that we try to prefer those soils where the sand quality or sandy texture is much greater than those pots in which it is lesser. Reason for this is these plants, especially those which are adapted to dry conditions, they prefer the soil to have lesser quantities of moisture. We normally refer to them as xerophytes. Or sometimes those plants which prefer those soils in which moisture quantity is higher, in those cases we see that we have to add lesser quantity of soil, these sands, and higher quantity of the clay or other soils, so that the moisture retention potential is higher than those in which we have sand. This has been seen directly affecting the quality as well as durability of the plants that we actually cultivate in these pots. Again, you can see, even though the pots are identical to look like, but in those, if we test the soil texture as well as the plant that we cultivate in them, you can see that different plants contain different types of soils as well as the different types of plants in them. This variation essentially refers to the fact that each plant in turn can be cultivated almost anywhere and everywhere. Once the soil as well as pot has been prepared fully, at that stage the plants that need to be cultivated in these pots can be transplanted. Here again, there are two ways of transplantation. Either we can transplant the seedlings, or we can as such transplant a rooted plant into these pots. Ordinarily, seedlings takes estimated about 3 to 6 months for its establishment in the pot, but if we use direct plantation, that is where a mature plant is transferred into a pot, that in turn can become commercially useful or ornamentally valuable within a span of a month's time. This is primarily because if we want to use it simply for ornamental purposes at home, at that stage we try to use normally productive plants. But if we want to use it for commercial trade or commercial production, in that case we tend to use seedlings, so that those seedlings in turn can be sold as such or can be transported across states as well as across the zones. Now here, another important aspect has cooped in, and that is wherein the polybags have been used as a substitute for pots. Again, you can see, ordinarily transportation of a pot from one area into another area, or from one district to another district, or from one state to another state is very cost effective, because the weightage of the pot as well as the size of the pot in turn drastically affects it in terms of commercial value. However, if we use polybags, sometimes we use the term as the polythene cultivars or polycultivars. In that case, what is done is that instead of using a pot, small polythene bags with a small pore either at the bottom or poles all around it, as you can see, are used for not only commercial cultivation but also transportation of the pot ornamentals. This has been seen suitable primarily for either transporting seedlings or transporting pot plants across states as well as across the regions. Now here you can see, in each of these polybags we have different sized pot plants, but each size in turn is in relation to the size of the polybag we use. Again, you can see smaller polybags containing smaller plants, larger polybags containing larger plants. This is primarily dependent upon the type of the plant that we want to cultivate. It has been seen that the transportation of polybags is easier as well as much cheaper than the transportation of the pots, which are either earthen or plastic polybags, or sometimes even cemented polybags. In this transportation, second important factor is that sometimes earthen pots or plastic pots or even cemented pots, because of the transportation, get broken, which in turn destroy the material that is lying within these pots. However, if we use polybags, irrespective of the travel we have to take it across, or the road we have to take it across, or irrespective of the transportation that we use, it has been seen that the polybags neither rupture nor in any way destroy the material that is lying in them. Then, depending upon the trade, when we see that we have to transport these to markets or sell them across different colonies, in those areas it has been seen that people tend to prefer purchase of polybags, so that polybag in turn can be used for transportation as well as cultivation within those pots, which look beautiful externally. As you can see, again, they look wonderful externally in terms of shape, in terms of drawings, in terms of structure, but actually they are not suitable for the commercial cultivation of ornamentals. Reason for that is that they do not have evaporative mechanism, that is, they do not have pores in the wall, they do not have a pore at the bottom, and that in turn can negatively affect the plants that we cultivate in them. In those cases, sometimes plant within a polybag or plant within an earthen pot is kept in those pots, so that externally it looks beautiful in terms of the shape and structure of that commercially constructed pot, but within that we have used ordinarily manufactured polybag pot or earthen pot, which, as you can see again, is actually not only able to facilitate the survival of the plant, but also is improving the quality of the plant that we use for commercial cultivation. Under normal practices, it has been seen that if we want to store these pots either as an ornamental outside in the lawns, or if we want to store and use them for ornamental purposes inside, that quality is actually dependent upon the type of the plants. We ordinarily categorize them into two types: those which prefer to be kept constantly in sunny conditions, and those which constantly prefer to be kept normally under shady conditions. That means, if we want to keep a pot in our drawing rooms or in our corridors, there we have to select a plant which actually has a preference for shade, while as those plants which we want to use for decorating our verandas or our lawns, in that case we have to select those plants which have a preference for absolute sunny conditions and which can sustain continuous exposure to sunlight. It has been seen that if by chance or by accident a pot gets planted or designed in a way where it is kept constantly in shade or constantly in sunny conditions, in that case the survival as well as durability of that pot gets affected. Again, as you can see, some pots which have been kept constantly in shady conditions, their productive potential, their quality, their shape, their structure gets varied, while as those which have been constantly kept in shady conditions, their structure, quality as well as commercial value gets depleted. This is because the conditions also play a vital role. Now, once we plant these and try to keep them in normal positions, in that case the other important factor is the pattern of irrigation. Is it necessary to irrigate pots continuously, or is it necessary to actually irrigate them as and when the soil seems to be dry on the surface? Ordinarily, a pot surface, that is when we have planted a pot with a specific type of the plant, we try to watch it every day. Even if we have irrigated in the morning, in the evening we will find the soil dry. That dry condition should not be considered as the dryness. Again, you can see here, top surface is completely dry, but the plant itself is appearing healthy. This is because apical surface, that is the top surface, seems to show dryness primarily because that is of the evaporative mechanism, whereas the basal part of the soil is actually still keeping its surface or its moisture as such. That means we have to irrigate these pots as and when the plant itself reflects the signs of dryness. In that case, you will see that the foliage of the plant that we cultivate in them, as you can see here, the foliage is showing drooping downwards, where the leaves drop downwards. That in turn reflects that the pot is in need of moisture. At that stage we have to irrigate it. However, if we cultivate the plants which are adapted to dry conditions, again as you can see, in these pots there is no evidence as to whether the moisture is required or whether there is no need of irrigating it consistently. That is primarily because they are actually adapted to those conditions where moisture sometimes is not available even for months together. In that case, it has been seen that irrigation primarily is required when we find that even the spiny structures, that is the leaf that gets converted into a spine, is showing tendency towards breaking, as you can see here. That means once these spines show tendency of breakage, that in turn reflects that they are in need of the irrigation or in need of the moisture. However, it has been seen that in winter, irrespective of the type of the pot that we have, whether it is a pot that contains xerophytic plant or a pot that contains normal plant, in that case during winter, irrigation is to be controlled in a way wherein no pot, whether xerophytic or hydrophytic or those which are adapted to temperate conditions, is not in any way getting destroyed because of the excessive quantities of the moisture. One example can be seen here. If we add excessive quantities of the moisture, we will find that the foliage structure, foliage density as well as foliage softness gets hampered, which in turn destroys the quality as well as the ornamental value of this pot plant. Again, you can see excessive moisture has been added, leaf size becomes larger, leaf becomes slightly softer, and the color also shows variation. This is in turn reflecting that excessive irrigation has been carried out in such pots. It has been seen that if the pots show any other signs apart from the signs of excessive irrigation, in that case 2 important parameters ought to be followed. One, wherein we may have to add desired nutrients on the basis of whatever plant has in terms of its requirements, or sometimes we have to dig out the soil around the basal portion of the plant. Again, you can see in some cases we add nutrients depending upon the color variation in the foliage, while as in some cases we try to dig around the basal portion of the pot plant, so that in turn loosens the soil texture, which automatically facilitates the evaporative mechanism and in turn is able to improve the commercial quality as well as the ornamental value of this pot plant. However, it has been seen that sometimes if excessive digging or excessive nutrients are added to these pots, that in turn also can destroy not only the plant itself, but also sometimes can partially hamper its ornamental value. As you can see again, in some cases excessive nutrient addition or excessive digging has been seen to destroy not only the plant as such, but also whatever its ornamental value was in terms of either the number of leaves or the size of leaves, color of leaves, number of flowers or size of flowers, which automatically shows that we must follow a very suitable pattern for maintenance of the pot oriented or pot cultivated plants. Then as I already mentioned, that we can sometimes cultivate tropical plants in temperate areas or temperate plants in tropical areas. Can we maintain these pots in winter or in summer in these 2 different areas? For that, we have to actually create or construct what is referred to as a pot house or sometimes even a hot house. Once we use the term pot house, it means that floricultural structure wherein we can actually maintain these pots during the desired periods, or wherein if we are talking about temperate areas, we can store these pots during winter in those areas, or if we are talking about hot houses, if we are cultivating ornamental plants in pots at say alpine, subalpine areas, in that case we have to create artificial heat by using specific methods, so that in that hot house we are able to maintain these pots during extreme cold climates or even extreme warm conditions, wherein we have to actually provide centrifugation for those in structures. That is, either we have to have greenhouse or we have to have pot house or we have to have hot house. It means that during the maintenance processes we can maintain these, but for that maintenance we must have specific structures, and these structures in turn can help us to maintain whatever types of pots or whatever types of plants that we have cultivated in these pots for as long as we want, and also can maintain their commercial as well as ornamental value. This was the first concept about as to how we can actually create pots and cultivate ornamentals within these pots under different equidistant conditions as well as under different climatic zones of the world. Thank you.